Well, it gives me immense pleasure to welcome Leslie Green, who will be speaking to us today on his paper on Constituting the People. Professor Green is the Professor of the Philosophy of Law at the University of Oxford and the Holden and Max Gordon Fellow at Yale. So welcome, Les.
Thank you very much, James. And it's a special pleasure to be here at NUS. I have lots of old friends in the audience. It's great to see you. And I've just realized I've never seen any of you here on home turf. So it's certainly time for a rematch. I'm going to read, if I may, just the first section of this paper, and then I'm going to omit sections 2 and 3 from my remarks today. Then I'll turn to 4 and the positive remarks at the end, although I still stand by everything in 2 and 3. I think those will be the most fruitful for our discussion. I'll just say a little bit about how this paper originated. It's part of a body of work in constitutional theory. It's one of the areas that interest me. And it arose as a result of one of those sort of after-dinner challenges in the Common Room at the time of the Scottish referendum, or I think we can now safely say the first Scottish independence referendum. I had a very small role in that and was going back and forth to Scotland, and someone said the thing that really disturbed them was how undemocratic the referendum was. I said, what did you mean? They said, well, nobody in England was going to get a vote on it. And this problem is well known to legal and political philosophers as the boundary problem. And I realized I didn't have a very good solution to it, although I was confident at the time that it was not undemocratic for the English not to vote in the Scottish independence referendum, and I set out to explain to myself why. This paper, to my own complete satisfaction, answers my question. In September 2014, Scots were asked in a referendum, should Scotland be an independent country? Independence was defeated by what was in England considered a wide margin, and in Scotland a narrow one. About 45% of those voting thought Scotland should leave the Union. Now, those supporting independence did so on a variety of grounds. Perhaps a few were romantic or cultural nationalists. Many more simply wanted rid of the morally exhausted UK parties, whether Conservative or Labour. But the most interesting view, I think, was a third one. Some Scots thought that an independent Scotland would be more democratic. They said that the constitutional status quo had an inbuilt democratic deficit, for no matter what the Scottish people wanted, they were destined to be forever dominated by English MPs. For Scotland had only 59 out of 650 seats at Westminster, and for 34 of the last 68 years, the party governing the UK had been repudiated by Scotland's voters. Economic austerity, the privatization of public resources, and now Scotland's likely ejection from the European Union had all been inflicted on her by UK governments. What sort of democracy was that? The Scottish National Party, then in government, concluded, I'll just quote from their research paper, Building a Modern Democracy. Independence for Scotland is the only solution that can eliminate this democratic deficit and remove these fundamental instabilities from the heart of the current political system in the UK. Only independence, completing the powers of the Scottish Parliament, can secure for Scotland the government and policy choices that the people of Scotland support. Now, as the referendum results showed, not everyone thought that was true. After all, it was defeated. But many Scots thought it was at least intelligible. And in this, they rejected what is now a very broad consensus among constitutional theorists. For everyone acknowledges that democracy means government by the people, but many insist that democracy cannot itself tell us who the relevant people should be. A constitutional democracy must take its idea of the people from something else, from nationality or from history or from geography. It cannot constitute the people. The English constitutionalist Ivor Jennings wrote, "The people cannot decide until someone decides who are the people." Likewise, in our day, Ronald writes, "We cannot find an answer to the question of who are the people in the ideal of democracy, because that ideal presupposes a political community and cannot be used to define one." Well, if Jennings and Dworkin are right, it follows that the Scots were not as much as mistaken in thinking that democracy might argue in favor of reconstituting the community. Rather, they had no coherent thoughts on the matter at all. But I think that Jennings, Dworkin, and the many others who share that view, in fact, I think almost everybody seems to share this view, are wrong. And that while I acknowledge that the democratic ideal cannot conclude the question of how the people should be constituted for the purposes of democratic government, I think it can contribute to it. And I want to try to persuade you of that this afternoon. Indeed, I think it's one of the central tasks of a democratic constitution to help get this right, to help constitute a democratic people. For those who know the paper, I'm going to omit the second and third questions about the nature of democracy and popular sovereignty and go on to the structure of the positive argument. Now, the democratic character of a constitution depends on its content, not on its mode of creation. So I argue in the second section that if, say, Scotland should become independent and then establish a military government, even if it did that democratically, that would not be constituting a democracy. And likewise, if an imperial power on demitting had left behind it a democratic organization, even although that had not been a democratically created constitution, that would be a democracy. So I'm distinguishing between the adjectival of the creation and the substance of the constitution. A people, or at any rate some peoples, I think also have the moral right to choose their own constitutions. But that's not democracy either. That's a matter of popular sovereignty. A democratic constitution must constitute certain fundamental legal powers, and in doing so it may also constitute a people, and that is a constitutional people, if you want, a post-constitutional people. So I say a bit more in the paper about what those powers are, but just to fix ideas, I'm thinking of the familiar things: universal adult suffrage, the rule of law, based certain range of democratic rights to vote, freedom of expression, association, and so forth. And of course, there are various ways we can interpret that and tweak it. But something fairly familiar. Now let's go back for a minute to Ronald Dworkin's challenge. Recall that Dworkin says we cannot find an answer to the question of the boundaries of a people in the ideal of democracy because that ideal presupposes a political community and cannot be used to define one. In Dworkin's view, democracy must operate with boundaries that are accidental, historical. Provided only that they meet certain non-democratic conditions, this is nothing to lose sleep over. Dworkin continues, the boundaries created by accidents in history remain the default. We're born into political communities, and these are our legitimate governors, provided they also meet the conditions of legitimacy. Dworkin's conditions of legitimacy are very demanding. Possibly no actual state meets them. In fact, no historical state ever came close to meeting them, so it follows immediately from Dworkin's view that there are no legitimate states, although he doesn't himself draw that conclusion. So Dworkin's is not the claim that might makes right, but it is a claim that insulates the boundaries of a people from the demands of the democratic ideal. The political philosopher Frederick Whalen comes to the same conclusion by a different route. He explores various proposals for how to constitute a people for democratic purposes. Take, for example, the idea that democracy requires general participation of people in their government. Whalen says, this presupposes an answer to the prior question, who may participate? Or, how do we determine membership in the group whose members are entitled to participate? And who is to participate, he continues, in making this decision? The same goes for the principle that all who are affected by a decision ought to be able to vote on it. Now, it's obvious this would be an awkward principle, since different groups are likely to have a different stake in different decisions, so it's unlikely to yield a unified answer, that's to say a unified electorate for any political organization. But that's nothing compared to this more fundamental worry. Whalen writes, before a democratic decision could be made on a particular issue by those affected, a prior decision would have to be made, in each case, as to who is affected, and therefore entitled to vote on the substantive issue. But by the very same principle, it too should presumably be made democratically, that is, by those affected by it, by the procedural doctrine, and now we encounter a regression from which no procedural escape is possible. Well, it is true, as Dworkin and Whalen both say that any principle for how to determine boundaries can be subjected to the question, and who's to determine that? That's to say, the satisfaction of the boundary determining principle. And that this question, in turn, can be subjected to a similar question and repeatedly down the line. But this is so whenever we both need a criterion for something and a decision rule for applying that criterion. This is not a problem of some limited resources of the democratic ideal. For example, the British Crown does not descend democratically. It descends, as determined by the Act of Settlement 1700, to Princess Sophia, the Electress of Hanover, and then, as the statute says, to the heirs of her body being Protestants. A little bit embarrassing in this day and age, and who knows, someday it may be corrected, but there you are. That's how the British Crown descends. And that's the criterion determining who gets to be the next monarch. But of course, someone needs to decide when that criterion is met. For example, whether a given person is an heir of his or her body, or is in fact a Protestant. It's not obvious really that whether Unitarians or Quakers or Mormons are counted as Protestants. Yeah? So someone will have to decide. And then someone will have to decide the principle on which we decide who's to decide. Should it, for example, fall to the courts, as it probably would as a matter of law, to determine who's a Protestant, or to Parliament, as some constitutional theorists think it should, or perhaps to the Archbishop of Canterbury. And this question, the just mentioned question, will in turn have to be decided by someone, political philosophers or someone, and so on. And if not political philosophers, maybe economists, and someone will have to decide that question. And you can see that this is going nowhere very fast. But notice this, Dworkin and Whalen's own preferred criterion for the boundaries of a people, namely accept what history delivers. It does not escape this either. Here too, someone will have to decide when the criterion is met. The criterion of historical settlement, to use Dworkin's version, is of course extremely vague. And even if we make it more precise, as Dworkin does in one passage, and say, well, let's accept any de facto boundaries that lasted for about 60 years, someone will have to decide when boundaries have actually lasted for 60 years. It's quite striking that in that footnote where he says, well, how about 60 years of stability? The example he chooses is Israel, which is a very peculiar example, as international lawyers will know. It's the postmodern country that has no well-defined boundaries, and certainly not ones that have been agreed either internally or externally for 60 years. It just sounded like looking for trouble, that example. Or think of Taiwan and so on, all these other interesting borderline cases. Someone will have to decide. And if we need to apply that decision, someone will need to decide how and when to apply that, and so on and so on. If this is a problem in legal theory, it's obviously an endemic one. It has nothing to do with constituting the boundaries of a people. If we have a criterion that specifies conditions under which something takes place or ought to take place, and the question arises, how do we determine whether the criterion is fulfilled? We have two questions. And that can be iterated for any question. Think about, here's another example where you can see it comes up quite quickly. Suppose someone says we should never use the criminal sanction except to prevent harm to others. Well, someone's going to have to decide when something is harmful to others. And then someone's going to have to decide how to decide, who's to decide when something is harmful to others, and so on and so on. So nothing very, something intriguing, but nothing very philosophically interesting about this fact that we can reiterate the questions, who's to say. Moreover, the proposal to defer to history, as Dworkin and Whalen and most other writers favor, is caught by the very objection that they raise. Nor is their proposal particularly useful, or more useful than anything else. For people tend to raise the question, but who are the people? Most urgently when it is not subject to historical settlement. Or, as in Scotland or the UK or the EU, when it looks like the settlement might, if pushed, unravel. In these circumstances, the historical default has nothing to say, except wait and see. And for another thing, even fairly established settlements, so forget Israel, but think of reasonably well-defined boundaries, say France or the United States for the time being. Even established settlements can become vulnerable. People have imaginations. They can wonder what life would be like if things were differently settled. They may have the capacity, together or in concert with others, to alter an existing settlement. They may begin to wonder whether they should exercise that capacity. For instance, it may occur to an Athenian that ancient Greek democracy is not all that democratic. I mean, he knows that the exclusion of women and slaves and metics from the people is well settled in ancient Athens. He may think that Greeks shouldn't even try to govern together with barbarians. He knows all the stories, both historical and philosophical, that try to justify that. But he still may not be persuaded. Should he try to unsettle the settled? Does the ideal of democracy suggest that he might try to include women or metics or slaves? I find it hard to believe that those questions are, as Dworkin and Whalen have committed to thinking, senseless, empty questions. Whether it's troubling that democracy somehow presupposes the idea of a people depends, I think, a bit on what we have in mind by a presupposition. Sometimes in law, a presupposition just refers to the pragmatic context of a remark. So, for example, if I say the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, that's a US statute, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act is valid, the normal context suggests I mean valid under the US Constitution. That's the presupposition. We do not normally assess the validity of statutes according to the constitutions of some other country. That'd be not impossible. These are the kind of pointless thing, an odd thing to do. Although, of course, we could do it for pedagogical or theoretical purposes. Pragmatic presuppositions of this sort, however, can be avoided just by making the intended context explicit. So I could say, for example, on an exam question, is the Religious Freedom Restoration Act valid under the British Constitution? Well, you all know the answer to that. Everything's valid under the British Constitution. On the other hand, if I say the Religious Freedom Restoration Act has been struck down, I'm presupposing something, namely that someone or other enacted it, for example, the US Congress. And this presupposition cannot be avoided just by flagging a particular context. It's a semantic and not just pragmatic feature of striking down that something had been enacted. I mean, if nothing had been enacted, there's nothing to strike down. That's not just a feature of a presupposition of the context. So if our ancient Athenian were to ask, were all the people consulted in this decision, it may be that the pragmatic context he faces suggests that all the people means all the free male adult citizens of Athens. But as I say, that presupposition can easily be shed, if that's what we have in mind by a presupposition. I mean, he could shed it just by referring to some other constitution and making it explicit that he wants to judge his domestic arrangements against those of another constitution or something in the poets or something in the philosophers. Judging it not against the background of the effective Athenian constitution, but against an ideal. And so now the question arises, could the ideal be democracy? This is the point in the argument in which the second semantic sense of presupposition seems to bite. And this is what I think Dworkin has in mind. For if democracy means government by the people, and we ask, as we surely can, and who are the people, we cannot informatively answer, well, those who govern as members of the people. I mean, it's true, but it's uninformative. But thinking that this is the only way that democracy could contribute to the question is part of what underlies the error that I claim rests in the conventional view. This is not the only way to bring the ideal of democratic government to bear on the question, who are the people? There is an alternative. So I'm going to sketch the alternative now, which I call the success condition. I apologize for my abstract. Autocorrect decided I should change that to the succession condition, which is actually a different condition, but it's the success condition. I'll try to explain it, motivate it, and then defend it from a few objections, and I'll open the floor. Suppose we're alone in the universe. All the people that there are here on this one blue planet. Many things need to be decided, and someone suggests, let's let the people do it. And another asks, but who are the people? And a third suggests, everyone. There should be one big government for the whole world. Each will count as one and only as one, and all will count. Objections to one big government rapidly leap to mind. For one thing, it's going to be pretty expensive. For another, perhaps, as Kant thought, it's going to be the graveyard of freedom, one big totalitarian government. But there's another thing to worry about, I think. One big government is not likely to be very democratic. Let me explain. As I suggested earlier, people worry about a democratic deficit in organizations as small as the United Kingdom, where it's already hard for members of the constituent nations to exercise popular control over governments. That, after all, is the nerve of British anxieties, or at any rate, the openly acknowledged anxieties about the European Union. By the way, the irony that British complaints about the EU are exactly the same as Scottish complaints about the UK is not lost on the Scots. Things would be worse, though, on a global scale for lots of reasons. How could we coordinate billions of people in elections, let alone in a deliberative or direct democracy? How large would a representative assembly have to be to give decent representation to the views of 7 billion people? How could any individual or individuals be heard? How could their voices count? And what about diversity? About 800 million of that electorate are illiterate. How will they receive or communicate information? Then there are entrenched hostilities to consider that prevent subgroups from trading, let alone governing together. And the global village is divided by language, by religion, and by values, and I find it hard to deny that people have a right to persist in those differences, or at least in many of them, in values, in religion, and in language. Even allowing for federalism, devolution, subsidiary, and all the other mechanisms by which we might produce an articulated one big government for the world, the planetary people are, I claim, radically unsuited to self-government. We need different groupings, in practice smaller groupings. And it's democracy that tells us that. Now, I don't want to let an awful lot hinge on the details of this fiction. I just try to motivate for you. You might think, well, it doesn't follow, I could think of other setups. I'm just trying to motivate for you the thought that's perfectly intelligible, to wonder whether the people could be constituted in a way as to be undemocratic. Government by the people does indeed require a people. So in the semantic sense of presupposition, you can't have government by the people without people. But precisely because it's government by the people, not something else, government by the people, there are constraints internal to that ideal on how they should be constituted. And the following principle, which I call the success principle, states what I take to be the most important of them. Here's the principle. A constitution should take as the people, for the purposes of government, only those who would have a reasonable success at governing themselves if constituted as a people. I'll read that again. A constitution should take as the people only those who would have reasonable success at governing themselves if constituted as a people. So I'm going to call that the success condition for constitutional democracy. I think it's facially plausible, for analogous conditions apply to many other associations that have, as government does, constitutive aims. For example, who should marry? Or if you like, who should marry whom? Well, only those who could have reasonable success in a marriage if they did marry. I mean, if they couldn't, they should get married, right? Of course, the success condition for democratic people no more picks out a unique set of self-governors than the success condition for marriage picks out a unique person, or probably for most of us, a unique person with whom you could have a successful marriage. Probably for most people, there are many people for whom one could. But clearly there's some people who could not marry at all, and some people who could not marry that person at all. And so we have some direction from the ideal of marriage, however we fill it in, for who ought to get married. And I want to suggest that in a parallel way, we have some direction, however we fill it in, from the democratic ideal of who the people should be. But the thesis whose intelligibility I'm defending, against Dworkin, Whalen, and others, is not that democracy can settle the question of who the people should be, but simply that contrary to the received view, it can bear on it. I say that the success condition shows that it can and how it can. 3 clarifications. First, the success condition is not a definition. It's not a definition for people. It's a norm, directing constitution makers and constitution evaluators, people like us sitting in a seminar today thinking about this question, how to think about the people to whom a constitution will allocate powers of self-governance. It does not tell us when a people amount to a nation, or an associative group, or a clan, or a tribe, or when they have popular sovereignty. It says that a democratic people should, though, be a group with a reasonable chance at self-government. Well, you ask, what counts as success? Democratic government is a form of government. So the constituted people must at least be able to do that, that's to say govern. They must have the capacity to govern to some standard of efficacy. But more than that, democracy is government by the people. That's after all what the word means. And so they're not only functional, but also modal requirements. The people must be such as that it's able to govern democratically, as opposed to in some other way, technocratically, or by priests, or by a monarchy or something. Now at this stage, I don't want to pin the notion down of democratic self-governments any more closely. In fact, I think it's important not to. For at this point, we want an account of the constitution of a people to leave room for and to be able to work with contending theories of what that requires. For example, at a minimum, both representative and direct views about democratic governance, or perhaps liberal views about democracy and socialist views about democracy. We wanted to be able to work with all these different accounts. It is not a failure in constitutional theory that some view does not itself answer all the important questions that bear on some issue. Modularity of this sort is, as they say, not a bug, but a feature of the program. Why, you ask, though, must democracy aim for success? Because government is a set of institutions with functions, and democratic government is to fulfill those functions in a particular way, democratically. I am not here assuming that government has some overall unifying function, the function of government. Aristotle was wrong about that. There is no task that falls to all governments and only to governments so as to pick them out amongst all other social institutions. In this respect, states and governments differ from more specialized organizations like hospitals or universities. States are multi-purpose things. But states, nevertheless, are things that should do whatever it is that they should do, which we inherit from another part of legal philosophy, whatever it is that they should do effectively. Because of its great instrumental value and the fact that so many depend on government, governing is an activity to be undertaken only when there is a decent prospect of success. Being unable to provide for necessary governance is, of course, one way any constitution can fail. It's an increasingly common complaint about the US Constitution, for example, that there are so many veto points that effective government has become nearly impossible. But democratic failure can happen even when effectiveness in government is secure. That, after all, was the Scots' complaint about the United Kingdom's constitution. The centralization of power within the parliamentary system, or anyway within that parliamentary system, is normally, even under coalition governments, able to avoid US-style gridlock. But it's not so responsive to the will of the people, or at any rate, not to the will of the people in Scotland. Note that not all human activities are subject in this way to a success condition. There is nothing wrong with playing the harpsichord, even if you're no good at it and will never improve. There's nothing wrong with constituting a pickup hockey team of absolutely hopeless players, just for fun. But governments should not be set up in that way. They should not be set up to fail. And they should not be set up in circumstances where they're likely to fail. And that applies also to government by the people, which is to say, to democracies. And if governments are to succeed at their ultimate aims, they also need to succeed at their approximate aims in the modalities of governing, the ways that a democracy has to govern itself. So, for example, at the most elementary level, it will need to be able to set norms to guide conduct. Basic thing government has to do, it has to prescribe some kind of norms, something. And success at that requires that they can correctly ascertain when that sort of guidance is needed, and when that sort of guidance is needed. For obviously, or at least obviously to me, not everything requires government of any kind, let alone collective self-government. I mean, we have the market to rely on for some things, families, social custom, convention, all sorts of stuff, and government. So success has an epistemic component. It also has a practical component. A self-governing people will have to be able to create norms together and to see to it that those norms are effective. That's to say, either obeyed, or if not obeyed, enforced among those whose conduct they are to govern. That's very, very abstract, but I think even at that level you see that there are going to be some substantive constraints that the ideal of democracy puts on constituting a people if that people is to govern democratically. Keep the following points in mind when you interpret the claim. First of all, the success condition is not a maximizing principle. It is a satisficing principle, to use the economist terms. It says that democratic people should be organized so that it has a reasonable chance at self-government. That's intended to allow a significant margin of appreciation, reflecting both our uncertainty about the prospects for success and the pressure of competing principles. I mean, democracy isn't the only thing to worry about. We also have to worry about justice and humanity and lots of other things. Our uncertainty about competing principles, not all of which we can specify in advance. For the same reason, the success condition does not require that we keep adding to the people until the democratic effectiveness of the government starts to decline. That A and B have no realistic chance of governing well together, or governing democratically together, is a reason for them not to be members of one constitutional people. But that C and D do have an excellent chance of governing well together is not a sufficient reason for them to unite. So, in this respect, again, it's just like marriage, right? You should not marry someone with whom you cannot have a successful marriage, but it doesn't follow you should marry all the people, for obvious reasons, with whom you could possibly have a successful marriage, or keep marrying people until the group of you married is so large that the marriage doesn't work anymore or something. Second thing to remember is that success is a people-constituting norm, but obviously it doesn't, well, I think it doesn't entail that actually existing governments whose people do a bad job of self-government ought to be torn down forthwith. After all, there are costs to change, to almost any change. Once governments are up and actually running, there are new facts in the world, including new expectations of other people's behavior. And these are often morally relevant, the expectations. And then there's also popular sovereignty to consider. Peoples are, in my view, sometimes allowed to make, not only to make errors, but to persist in them. So I think it's a requirement of popular sovereignty, not a requirement of democracy, that say the people of Syria ought to be able to choose what sort of government they want for themselves. If they choose a theocracy, we would respect that in the name of popular sovereignty, but not in the name of democracy. Huh? If they chose a democracy, there might be a reason to respect it in the name of democracy. So I'm distinguishing popular sovereignty and democracy. So it's important to an earlier part of my argument, but in the US literature this is commonly confounded. Americans think popular sovereignty means democracy. It doesn't at all. It's the right of the people to choose the sort of constitution they want. Third, the success condition helps pick out a set of people who are the powers of self-government, but it does not, at least I don't think it does, provide what we might think of as the criterion of legal citizenship, if we understand that as full membership in a political society. But I'm not exactly sure about this, but I think this is right. For citizenship, we'll normally have further requirements. We can think of reasons why it might be further things you have to have to be a citizen rather to be allowed to participate, say, as a permanent resident in the government society. That's normally the law, but I think it's a good principle as well. Nor is it a jurisdictional principle, for every constitution, including every democratic constitution, claims authority over some people who are not members of the political community at all, and over those who are not full members of the community, so infants and children, jurisdiction over tourists, some extraterritorial authority, and so forth. So those three qualifications show that success can only be one of the principles for constituting a democratic people. Its significance, however, is that it frames these other principles, I claim, and explains the normative force of many of them. And this is where I think writers like Dworkin and Whalen go wrong. They observe correctly that in some way, historical facts, sociology, sense of belonging, community have something to do with justifiable boundaries, but they think that shows that democracy has no place. My claim is that most popular suggestions, like those ones, about how democratic communities should be constituted, say by people with a shared history, or a sense of nationality, or living in a compact geographical area, or having common and distinctive interests, all those suggestions are pertinent because, and only because, they do play a role in determining whether the success condition is satisfied. After all, it's a common and plausible conjecture that people who share a lot are well adapted to self-government, or governing together. Now, whether they need to share values or particular knowledge is, of course, much more disputed than whether they need only share skills and general epistemological virtues. For example, a willingness to shoulder what Rawls calls the burdens of judgment, or a sense of live and let live, or mutual tolerance. So I'm not arguing they need to share anything deeper by way of values. But the sort of political engagement required of a democratic people is undeniably more demanding than, say, what's required of a people who are to be governed passively by priests, or by the military, or by technocrats. Seen in light of the success condition, the accidents of history, and all those familiar things that writers mention, are not alternatives to a democratic way of constituting the people, but are a common instrumental requirement of it. We may feel a bit nervous about this conclusion for two reasons, both of them familiar. The first is that views about the conditions for successful self-government have often been clouded by hatred, prejudice, and simple error. We needn't look as far as the fanatical nationalisms and theocratic fantasies that have ruined and continue to ruin scores of countries and millions of lives. Even as mild and liberal a Democrat as J.S. Mill could go badly wrong on this score. Mill wrote, this is in Representative Government, "Among the people without fellow feeling, especially if they read and speak different languages, the united public opinion necessary to the working of representative government would not exist." But the successful multicultural democracies, that's to say in the modern world, all of the successful democracies, stand as obvious counterexamples to Mill's pessimistic view. Mill just misunderstood the dimensions along which public opinion has to unite, and he underestimated the resources that representative institutions have for accommodating and incorporating cultural differences. But we can learn from Mill's errors. After all, we've made them often enough, and we're familiar with the main prophylactics. The second worry, and I'm going to end with this, is uncertainty. The success condition involves guesses about future contingencies and about many counterfactual propositions. Any view we come to about it will be fallible, but that's not the same as assuming that it will be falsified. I think that there are actually things to be learned from political sociology, from social psychology, from political economy, and from history. Now, if our uncertainty about success is radical, then we will be radically uncertain about who the people should be. We'll just carry over. We don't know whether they could succeed at self-government. But that would be an objection to my view, as opposed to a disappointment. Only if we had a better reason to be confident in how a democratic people should be constituted than we have in whether the success condition should be satisfied. I see no reason at all to believe that. What, finally, then, about Scotland and the United Kingdom? It will not have escaped your notice that I have not provided an answer to the question posed in 2014, should Scotland be an independent country? But I've tried to show how the answer that moved so many Scots, yes, because that would be more democratic, is, at very least, perfectly intelligible. A constitution should take as the people only those who would have reasonable success at governing themselves if constituted as a people. The Scots were divided on the prospects of success for the United Kingdom, at least as presently constituted. But contrary to the opinion of many constitutional theorists, they were quite correct in thinking that this is a real and central question. And soon they will, if so permitted by England, return to it. Thank you.